After literally years of begging from the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, to the United States, pleading with Biden for the use of long-range weapons from the United States and the West to be able to fire deep into Russian territory, President Biden has now greenlit that move and has now allowed, at least according to some sources, Ukraine to use it. And according to other sources, actually, they have already been used. Overnight, there's reports that 6 ATACMS missiles were fired into Bryansk, a region about 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. According to the Russian reports, 4 or 5 of the 6 were shot down. The 6th one was deflected and had some small activity on the ground or reaction on the ground, but nothing of substance was hit. And we'll see what all this results in, because 2 months before the end of the Biden administration, after saying no for all of his term in office, and now 2 months before he's going to be out of office, he seems to be wanting to stir the pot where somebody else will have to deal with the consequences. To try and unpack this and try to find out what's significant and what is not, we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman, former Defense Department and senior State Department official, ambassador all over the place. Really grateful to have you back today, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Nice to be back, although it's a rather tense moment.
Well, it is. And, you know, if the American people thought that, hey, we elected Donald Trump in part because he was running on a platform that is going to end the Russia-Ukraine war, and to get that off the table, and then he has said subsequently that is exactly what he plans to do. Now, all of a sudden, this move by the Biden White House, after many, many, many months, and actually a couple of years at least, well, actually, you can really go back all the way to the beginning. So close to 3 years, Zelensky has been asking for permission to use long-range American weapons to strike deep into Russia. He's always said no. Why do you suppose now, 60 days before the end of his term, he said yes?
I have to assume that it is a last-minute gesture as he goes out, trying to avoid the blame for the fact that Ukraine is going down, and laying that at the feet of his successor, who, by the way, has quite forthrightly condemned his move for being as a dangerous and irresponsible action by Biden and neoconservatives. Of course, some of those neoconservatives seem to be coming into the Trump administration, so I'm not quite clear what the basis for condemning neoconservatives is. But I think, there are a couple of interesting elements to this. One is that, as Mr. Putin has repeatedly said quite correctly, ATACMS, which is what was used, cannot be operated by anyone but Americans. That is because the targeting information comes from American satellites and is downloaded, and it is highly classified and cannot be shared without an American presence. So this is, in effect, a direct American attack on Bryansk. And I think the Russian spokesman, Peskov, and others have identified it as such and said that there will be a serious proportionate response. Now, what is proportionate? I think because the Americans are involved, Ukraine is still not able to use these weapons in the manner in which it has used other weapons inside Ukraine, and that is indiscriminately against civilians. That's how this war began in 2014 with the civil war with the Ukrainian East, and attacks on all sorts of civilian facilities, sometimes justifiably, because if there were military use of those facilities, that made it a legitimate military target. This target inside Russia was an arms dump. It was a depot, and therefore it was a military rather than a civilian target. If the Russians are true to form, then the proportionate response will be directed at comparable military targets, not at civilian targets. Here's the problem. That target was deep in Russia. And proportionate response would call for an attack on something deep in NATO or the United States. And it is not impossible to imagine that we have just given Russia an excuse for reciprocating our destruction of Nord Stream 2 some time back with sabotage. Now, we have shown in this war in Ukraine, or it has been demonstrated, that we do not have the industrial surge capacity or the capacity in our military industrial sector to support a war of attrition. So that is a grave weakness of our war machine. And I can't help but imagine that there are those in Russia who will now be advocating an attack, probably by sabotage, mirroring the Nord Stream 2 attack on our military industrial base or the military industrial base in Western Europe with some sort of plausibly deniable connection there, which, however, will probably be fairly obvious what happened in the beginning. I think we have to take the Russians seriously. I note that Peskov and others have not mentioned nuclear weapons, although the immediate response to this attack by President Putin was to sign the new nuclear doctrine, which says that if a country allied with a nuclear power attacks Russia, that will be treated like an attack by a nuclear power on Russia, thereby justifying the use of nuclear weapons at Russian discretion. That is, Russia will have the right to make a choice to use nuclear weapons. So this is certainly very dangerous, and I think President-elect Trump's condemnation of it is entirely correct, and it indicates that he is repudiating directly every element of the Biden policy toward Russia over the last 3 years. So 2 years, sorry. So I think this is a very significant moment. It is a tense moment. It is a dangerous moment. I hope I'm correct that there is still some American restraint on Ukrainian actions, as there is not in the case of Israel's actions in Gaza and in Lebanon, and that Mr. Biden is not going out getting us into an even wider and more devastating war than the one he helped start in Ukraine.
Well, we certainly have to hope that's the case. It's interesting that you point out that the Russians have overtly acknowledged what, basically, frankly, other American military experts have actually conceded over the last number of months when these things are being discussed, that they actually can't be operated without direct American participation to some degree or another. Or so that's what some have said. But we had yesterday, Jake Sullivan seemed to claim, hey, if we give these long-range weapons, and he was very clear to say, now I'm not confirming or denying that we are, but if anyone did, well, watch him.
The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, today has responded saying that, yes, there is no official confirmation, and if there were, it would mean that there was direct involvement of the United States in the war.
If the U.S. were to authorize the use of any weapon system, including this weapon system, it wouldn't mean direct U.S. participation in the war. It would mean a continuation of the policy we've had since the war began, which is that we supply the means to Ukraine to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and they fight the war.
Now, and that may work to some in the United States. Some who people don't know. They hear Sullivan say that, and they see, like, M1 tanks and Bradleys and all these other kind of things that we've saw. Yeah, we just handed it to them and they fought. So sure, this is the same thing. But to the Russians, they're not fooled by that.
No, I think many people will not be fooled by that. It is an equivocation, if not an outright lie. I have a great respect for the Jesuits, one of whom said, the truth I tell to everyone, but not all of it. And I withhold some things to people entirely. And I think Mr. Sullivan is guilty of that kind of equivocation. This is a direct American involvement by any standard, just as we are complicit in Israel's actions because of what we are doing there. And it turns out we've been providing intelligence support there too, as have the British. This is American complicity in an attack on Russian territory deep inside it. Not so deep, I would note, to actually counter the Russian Air Force, which is farther back, and which is not threatened by this. But this was a, what do you call it, a cluster attack, a swarm, if you will. There were 6 missiles. I don't know how many missile ATACMS we gave to the Ukrainians. If they keep using them like this, they're going to be out of them before very long. But I wouldn't underestimate the significance of this. And under international law, Russia has a perfect right to retaliate proportionately. That is, against a military installation on the territory of the United States or a NATO member. Now, whether it will do that or not, I don't know. It has been very careful up to now to avoid doing that sort of thing, as indeed the Biden administration, I think, no thanks to Mr. Sullivan, I think thanks to people in the Defense Department who have been very cautious on this subject. We have not crossed this red line previously. Now I think we have. And Mr. Biden's got 2 months left, if that. It's just, and he can do a lot of damage in that time. And I think that's what President Trump was cautioning him against.
Now, this particular target that they went after was one that had significant air defense around it. And it hasn't, nothing apparently struck anything of any vital nature. So it would appear that Putin still has the flexibility to not respond here in any way that could escalate the situation that he might calculate would be to his harm. But we have to be concerned that if maybe they fire another round at something that's maybe less important, but also less defended, and it does strike home, then there's going to be the real risk of escalation. And you just touched on a little bit of it, but I'm going to echo that by a former advisor to Vladimir Putin, Sergei Maskov, who said this.
If United States and Great Britain are now directly taking part in war against Russia, it means that all militaries of US and Great Britain are becoming legitimate goals for the Russian military. So as a first step, we can say that some of the probably intelligence aviation jet could be crashed by Russian army. And some of the satellite of the United States, Great Britain also could be attacked and could be crushed. On the next stage,
are you saying that the United Kingdom is now a target for Russia?
United Kingdom now not target yet, because these attacks of the Storm Shadow didn't happen yet. If Storm Shadow will attack Russian territory, with participation of British officers and American officers, Great Britain will put own militaries as legitimate goals, targets for the Russian militaries automatically. If you decided to kill us, we have to protect ourselves.
And so if these missiles actually kill Russian troops or Russian civilians, and it's sitting, then I think that you have the risk of them actually taking that kind of action that you mentioned. And now here we have this former advisor to Putin himself saying the same thing. But what do you say to those people? Frankly, a lot of them are neocons and other people that just say, yeah, Russia says that, but they would never do that because they know Article 5 would bring the whole thing in, nuclear war, and they would never survive. Ergo, they'll never do anything. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's about 4 questions. I certainly would not say what our leadership said before 9/11. They wouldn't dare do that. We bomb them, we kill them. They wouldn't dare shoot back. Now, that was our attitude. We're invulnerable because we're so powerful. And that proved to be wrong. And I think it would prove to be wrong in the case of Russia. The question that was just raised, however, is very interesting. And that is taking out the satellites that provide the targeting information for the ATACMS. That is now something that obviously Russians are considering. The third point, I don't know what the government of Britain, Great Britain, or France will now do. Both have long-range attack capabilities, which they've been debating, letting the Ukrainians use, that is the storm shadow in the case of Britain and a comparable system in France. And they actually, the French and the British, have been posturing and saying that they're in favor of long-range strikes, and why doesn't the United States authorize this? That was Keir Starmer's point of view when he came to Washington to meet with President Joe Biden. What are they going to do now? I think they've just been put, this is the fourth point, I think they've just been put on notice from President-elect Trump that he will not support that kind of policy, and he will not come to their rescue if they take risks that he considers unjustified. So this is pretty complicated, and we are in the middle of a presidential transition, apparently a fairly disorganized one, which is a sobering thought, because every 4 or 8 years, the United States government administers a frontal lobotomy to itself, and then it takes quite a while to grow the brain cells back. Everybody's headed for K Street or Wall Street or someplace. And I would also note, in the middle of all this, I think it's a related topic, we have President Trump threatening to fire all sorts of generals because he doesn't think they're politically supportive, starting with the colleagues of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, and continuing to others. I guess my reaction to that is, why not just do what the Soviet and Chinese armies did and have a political commissar system? My feeling is that a dual command system is extremely ineffectual. And I think Mr. Trump's threats to politicize the military more than they are is a weakness for us. So we are in a bit of turmoil at home. And I don't know what the British and French are going to do, but I would say it's a grave mistake to assume that if you shoot at someone, they won't shoot back.
Yeah, that's never a safe bet.
Let me just add one other point. I don't think the question is how many people die from a strike, although that if a large number of people are killed or wounded, that generates a huge domestic political pressure on any government to respond forcefully. As long as there is no great amount of human damage, my feeling is Mr. Putin, who is a very rational, risk-averse person, notwithstanding the way he's portrayed in the West, I think he will be very cautious. But if there are a significant number of people killed, then I think he will not be able to exercise that degree of restraint.
Now, then that's one of the biggest concerns I have with this entire affair. I want to turn real quick to look at some of the potential reasons behind this. What the administration thinks they're going to accomplish, because I can't imagine that they would take some kind of action that they believe would be harmful either to themselves or to the United States. So they must have some idea of what would be good. But here's something that makes it even more puzzling than it already is. In that same interview with Jake Sullivan, where he denied that the U.S. would have any role if the ATACMS were used, he also talks about a number of things that have been used over the previous nearly 3 years of this war. And watch this.
We've provided the tanks, we provided the F-16s, we provided the HIMARS, we provided the Patriots, we provided many of the things that you said earlier we wouldn't provide. And it's not back then, it's rather today that Ukraine finds itself in a more challenged position on the battlefield, suggesting that there's not a straight line between those weapon systems and how it does on the battlefield. Where is the straightest line between Ukrainian performance and inputs? It's on mobilization of manpower.
So he literally lays out why all of these so-called, silver bullets that had been come up and all these things that we wanted before and that Biden allegedly delayed and then finally gave them, when they showed up on the battlefield, they didn't make any difference. So if you acknowledge that in one sentence, then by what rationale can you say, so we'll add one more thing to that failed list before we get out of office?
Again, several comments. The immediate rationale has to be political because there's no military rationale. That is to say, this isn't going to turn the tide in Kursk, where they apparently the Ukrainians want to use the attackings to save their beleaguered invasion force, it's not going to turn the tide in the battles as a whole or win the war for Ukraine. So there's no military rationale. It is a political rationale, and it is, as the Biden administration goes out, don't blame us. We did everything we could. We were very cautious. We didn't start a war directly with Russia. We gave the Ukrainians pretty much everything they asked for, although we were cautious in doing so. We didn't do it as rapidly as some would have liked. But if the Ukrainians lose the war, that's their fault, not ours, because they didn't do a mass mobilization. Basically, we're right on the same track that we were from the beginning. Let's bring Russia to its knees, and by fighting to the last Ukrainian. Well, it turns out that some Ukrainians don't want to be killed on the battlefield. A lot of people are actually drowning, trying to swim rivers to get out to Romania. Others are engaged in corruption, still bribery to prevent conscription. Still others go to the front and desert to the Russians. So this is a canard, but it's a useful political one, and it's all intended to lay the blame for the loss on the Ukrainians and conceivably on the incoming Trump administration. The failure of the policy has been obvious for some time, and we are in denial about it. And if you listen to what Mr. Sullivan just said, I recall that every one of those weapon systems that he mentioned was going to be the magic silver bullet that was going to win the war for the Ukrainians. Wow, M1A2 tanks turn up and the war is over. No, I'm sorry to say one of the most depressing bits of the results of this whole exercise is to show that our weapon systems are overpriced, over-engineered, and inadequate in their numbers. They have not performed up to snuff against the Russians, and the Russians, who started out badly, I don't think they were terribly prepared to invade Ukraine, and they basically had a very rough time in the beginning. The Russians have learned how to cope with virtually every NATO weapons system, and as in the case of ATACMS, okay, 6 missiles are fired, 1 gets through. And by the way, I don't think we really know what the battle damage was from that. So I'd be cautious about minimizing it, although the Russians clearly have a reason to do so. We've seen in the case of the exchanges between Israel and Iran that each side magnifies the effects of its own attacks and minimizes the effects of the attacks it suffered. And I think something similar is probably going on here.
Yeah, we're going to have to wait to see on that. It's so fresh. I mean, it's literally just hours old, and we only have the Russian claims at this point. And I'm sure that there'll be satellite imagery and looking at this from civilians. And so hopefully we'll be able to get that clarified. But I want to look back at one of the other advocates of this. And you mentioned that President Trump apparently said he wants to get rid of a lot of the neocons. One wonders if maybe one of the chief neocons he was talking about was General Jack Keane, who is now saying something kind of odd. He has always been saying that we need to give them all this support and all these other kinds of weapon systems so that they can win the war. But see if you detect a change in his outcome here.
This is a step in the right direction. We've got to give Ukraine more leverage and also push Putin into those negotiations, and certainly releasing the long-range missiles to be able to attack inside of Russia, where Russia's been attacking all these since the war began into Ukraine, makes compelling sense. Also, the Brits and the French are going to be able to do the same. The problem is they're restricting it just to the Kursk area, and that doesn't make any sense. It's another paralysis on a part of the administration, taking the knee to the threat of nuclear weapons. Can you imagine Putin's going to use a nuclear weapon now in the next couple of months before the Trump administration comes in? Does that make any sense to anybody in the world?
So there's other ones, a lot to unpack here, but let's start with the last thing he just said there. he'd literally mock any possibility that this could go into, escalate into nuclear exchange, somehow before Trump, like that Putin is waiting to make any actions on when President Trump comes into office. What do you say to that?
I've been very dubious about the prospect of nuclear escalation from the beginning. It might happen if the Russians were losing, but they're not. I think I feel for the poor Ukrainians who are trapped in Kursk now. I don't know whether there are North Korean troops there or not. The fact that we don't really know, but the statement that there are North Korean troops there has been cited as a reason to escalate against Russia with the attackers. I also don't know, as I said, whether the British and French will want to cross incoming President Trump and supply those missiles even to attack Kursk. So I think this doesn't make much sense to me.
And what about the other aspect? Because before, Keane and actually lots of these neocons, and Gary actually put together a big cumulative comments from a bunch of generals and a bunch of these other people saying, yeah, this was a great idea, definitely do it. And then nearly all of them say, of course, it's not going to actually change anything on the battlefield, but it's something that we should do. Now, Keane is adding in, this can help push Putin into a negotiated settlement.
That is absurd, because from the very beginning, this began with a demand from Putin for negotiations, which we rejected. And Stoltenberg has been, the former Secretary General of NATO, has been very clear on this. He wanted to prevent the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, and he went to war to do this after we refused to discuss the matter. And I want to say something which I think is very important. We tend to get bogged down in immediate issues. That's understandable. But it's past time to start thinking about how to restore peace to Europe. I think Mr. Trump's condemnation of the Biden administration focused really on the wrong issue, which was he called for a cessation of the fighting, a ceasefire. If that leads to something like the division of Korea with a demilitarized zone, it will be a disaster for Europe forever. This war needs to be the leverage that puts us into a much needed discussion of how to provide reassurance to Europeans and Russians both that each is not subject to a threat from the other. And here, therefore, I think I've been talking to some Russians recently, and they are very understandably extremely hardline. That is to say, they've spent blood and treasure, they've suffered. Their whole relationship with Europe has been severed. Their energy exports have been crippled to Europe. And then they say, well, I'm arguing with them. Look, it's in your interest to be magnanimous. You're winning the war, but you have a problem. You have been estranged from Europe. You're alienated from it. You are part of Europe. You need to be part of Europe. Europeans need a good relationship with you for their own security and prosperity, and you need one with them. And if you go into a negotiation now and you are unwilling to provide face-saving compromises on any issues, for example, with regard to the 4 oblasts that you have annexed, and I have a thought about that, which the Russians, I must say, don't like. That's okay. You talk to people who are your adversaries because they don't like what you want them to do, and you have to persuade them to do that. And the question is, who is it that's coming in the new administration who has the ability to do that? Do we know how to do diplomacy anymore? Anyway, so I have argued with the Russians. Look, here's my suggestion. I think you should be magnanimous. I think you should say, okay, we have annexed these 4 oblasts. Maybe if the war goes on, there will be Odessa too. And they are now part of the Russian Federation. They are autonomous parts of the Russian Federation. We propose that they remain so for 20 years. At the end of the 20 years, there should be a referendum in these oblasts. Do they wish to remain permanently part of Russia? Do they wish to rejoin Ukraine, which gives the Ukrainians an incentive to court them, be decent to them, not resume the kind of catastrophic civil war that right-wing Western Ukrainians launched in 2014? Is Ukraine prepared to accept a Russian-speaking minority in its borders? If it isn't, then I don't think it has any chance of recovering these oblasts by any means, peaceful or military. And the third proposition would be, if you don't want to be either part of either Russia or Ukraine, fine, you can become buffer states. You can become independent states that are a buffer between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. One thing is absolutely clear, and that it has been clear from the beginning: Ukraine is not going into NATO. Not only because the Russians have shown they will pay a huge price on the battlefield to prevent that, and risk a general war with the United States to prevent that, but also because there are members of NATO who don't want Ukraine in NATO. And it has to be a unanimous decision. It was difficult enough to get the Finns and Swedes in, given objections to some of their policies by Turkey, Hungary, and others. I think we need to be realistic. That is off the table. So the question is, how do we help craft, and what role does Russia have in producing a neutral, democratic, prosperous Ukraine with an honest government? It is not democratic. It is not honest. It is corrupt, and it is not a prosperous or promising state at the moment, having lost a huge amount of its population, a whole generation of young men, and having been bombed and strafed by the Russians, who are actually stepping up their efforts to cripple the energy supply in the winter. Odessa's without heat. I don't know whether you have been in countries that followed the Soviet model of development, but the typical heating system in cities in the Soviet Union was, and Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, was a central heating plant with pipes that went underground and heated buildings all over the city.
Yeah.
And then I think, you can take that out. So Ukraine needs to have an independent, prosperous future. The model for that from the beginning has been the Austrian State Treaty of 56, which we reached with the Soviet Union at the very height of the Cold War. It created a neutral, independent Austria, which is very prosperous and democratic now, and it also demanded of the Austrians that they treat their linguistic and ethnic minorities fairly.
Right.
And the same demands and same advantages should be offered to Ukraine.
Would love to see that, but there's a lot of roadblocks to that coming in, not the least of which is the guy that currently sits on the top of the Ukrainian government, who, instead of recognizing that the need for what you're talking about there, is saying stuff like this.
Today is the best moment to push Russia harder, and it's clear without certain key factors, Russia will lack real motivation to engage in meaningful negotiations. Without fires in its ammunition depots on Russian territory, without disrupted military logistics, without destroyed Russian air bases, without its lost capabilities to produce missiles and drones, and without its assets being confiscated. You know very well that Putin does not value people or rules. He values only money and power. These are the things we must take away from him to restore peace.
And when he's talking about, he didn't say attack, he said destroy Russian air bases deep in there and hit logistics, et cetera, which would be a
confiscate
a
things.
massive missile barrage, which we don't have the missiles for anyway. But
Look,
that's where his mind is right now. And there is no reason why Russia would ever want to come to any kind of an accommodation with that. How do you see that developing?
Well, I think he probably resembles Jefferson Davis in the last days of the Confederacy. Unconditional surrender is an American idea which we've applied to our Civil War, to World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And now Zelensky, with no prospect of any kind of victory over the Russians, is proposing to apply it to Russia. So Russia should basically surrender, repent, and be saved, and we will conduct reconstruction in it to cure it of its moral defects. This is just totally unrealistic, and it illustrates a key point that contradicts General Keene's thesis and that of many others, that we need to push Mr. Putin and the Russians into a negotiation. They're not the ones refusing to negotiate. And then when Mr. Zelensky says they negotiate in good faith, he means they give up everything that they've sacrificed, including NATO, including allowing Ukraine to go into NATO, including Ukraine to recover Crimea, Ukraine to recover the other 4 oblasts that are now partially controlled by the Russians. Fine. I know of no negotiation in any context that can proceed on an utterly unrealistic basis. And when you come to the question of war and peace, it's what happens on the battlefield that determines the parameters of what kind of peace you can have. And we need a peace in Ukraine. Europeans need it. The history shows that without a constructive relationship between Russia and the rest of Europe, neither can prosper or be secure. And we shouldn't discount the fear that Russians have of invasion, which is far more realistic than that of the Europeans. The only time Russia invaded Western Europe historically was twice. Once to defeat Napoleon, who had first invaded Russia, and second to defeat Adolf Hitler, who had done the same. And the Russians, after the Napoleonic Wars, ended up in Paris, which is why we have the word bistro, which in Russian means quick, fast. Bistros are fast food joints, which the Russian troops insisted upon when they were in Paris, occupying it. But they left, and the Cold War is over. The former satellite states, who suffered greatly under the domination of the Soviet Union, are now free, and some of them have their own ideas. They don't necessarily agree with us. Some are very anti-Russian. Some are more accommodating of Russia. But they all, in the end, need to have a decent relationship with Russia, or suffer the consequences, which are constant anxiety about their security. So there's every reason to go back to the reasons that Mr. Putin stated in December 2021 to have a neutral Ukraine, linguistic rights for minorities in Ukraine, consistent with the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or now the Organization of Cooperation and Security in Europe, which stipulates that this is a requirement consistent with European human rights standards. And finally, some kind of grand bargain that relieves both Moscow and Paris, London, Berlin, Rome, and other capitals of any feeling that war is imminent and that they have to spend heavily on rearmament in order to deter an attack. The best way to get rid of a threat is through diplomacy, as Abraham Lincoln said, when I make friends with an enemy, I destroy an enemy.
That is the without question, that's the best way to get there. Now, in the last bit of a time we have here, I wonder if you can just kind of, I guess, give your vision or interpretation of what the landscape may look like post January 20th, because you have a number of things working in. You have right now, you have Keir Starmer and Macron, which are still pretty pretty hawkish on the Russia situation. You have Fico and Orban, which are saying really kind of what you're saying. Let's just get this off the table and get back to having a relationship with Russia. You have obviously President Trump coming in with a very different mindset than the current administration. And the last part is that there is now starting to be open discussion among the West that 2025 needs to have a presidential election in Ukraine. So Zelensky doesn't get to just go on indefinitely. So you have all those things swirling around. How might that change the diplomatic landscape?
Well, I think there are major changes in prospect. Among other things, President-elect Trump has declared clearly his intention to sponsor a thorough re-examination and restructuring of NATO. In my view, that restructuring should include the Europeanization of NATO and the United States stepping back from being on the front line in Europe and insisting that Europeans provide the first line of defense for themselves rather than us. That in itself will change things in several ways. As I indicated, I think Mr. Starmer and President Macron both have their eyes on exactly the question you posed. What will the second coming of Donald Trump mean for them and for Europe? And I think from the French point of view, and I think I would expect Macron to push hard on this, if the United States, in fact, is going to disentangle itself to some extent from Europe and NATO, then this is an opportunity. This is, first of all, a demand that Europeans get their act together, which is something that President Trump has consistently advocated. And second, it's an opportunity for Europeans to take greater control of their own destiny. And obviously, Mr. Macron, being French and Gaullist and inspiration, will want to see France as the leader of a united Europe. I think the British may have a different idea. They historically have. The question would be, what's the reaction of the Germans? Well, the Germans are in a moment of turmoil too. The first results of Mr. Trump's election were to persuade Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, that Germany needed to hedge both against an impending trade war with the United States, because Europe has a huge trade surplus with us, and that is unacceptable to Mr. Trump. And second, over exactly the sort of re-examination and restructuring of NATO that Mr. Trump proposes. And he lost in his own cabinet. He lost his coalition partner, one of them. And the result is that he's headed for a vote of no confidence, January 15, 5 days before Mr. Trump takes office, and an early election, perhaps earlier even than March, which is what has been predicted. So, that the Europeans are beginning to react already. We also have the issue of China, where predictability has disappeared in our relationship with China. And we have an administration coming in that is packed with extreme hardline anti-Chinese figures. And we have a focus on China as the only power with the potential to displace our global primacy. I don't think the Chinese want to do that. That is, we're in an awkward period where the United States has discredited its own leadership and can't lead, and the Chinese are unwilling to fill the vacuum. But how long that will last, I don't know. In the 19th century, we continuously condemned the British for being hegemonic and said we would never do that. But at the end of the 19th century, in the earliest 20th century, we joined the ranks of imperialist powers with multiple interventions abroad, and we captured the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and we kept Guantanamo in Cuba, and we have very much been hegemonic. So I don't know whether the Chinese will succumb to that in that tendency or not, but we have a lot on our plate, and I think myself that we need to fix our domestic problems, which are manifest. We need to focus on fixing our government our system, our economics at home. It is no accident that Mr. Trump was elected. If you consider that in the last 5 years, rents have doubled, the price of eggs has gone up threefold. People can't even pay the electric bill, let alone buy groceries. And all this talk by the Biden administration and Kamala Harris about how wonderful the economy was because there was full employment really was not persuasive. So I would hope that we would be more, as Mr. Trump says, we would put our own interests first, but we would do it in a responsible manner through consultation with allies and partners abroad, not unilaterally or abruptly.
Well, you will certainly advocate for that. I would love to see something like that happen because there's lots of troubles and lots of problems, as you identified, not even all of them, but they are things that can be navigated if we have the right focus and we don't get sucked into any wars. And we didn't even talk about the Middle East today. We'll do that next time. But there's a whole lot of problems that are there as well. But it's a very difficult task coming ahead. And the best thing we can do is to avoid any unnecessary wars. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming back on today. Always a pleasure to have you on, Mr. Ambassador, because you provide a framework and an understanding of that most of us just don't have because of your extensive experience in this and your roadmaps to where we can go. So we're very grateful for that. Very grateful for you guys watching with us today as well. Always a pleasure to have you on with us. And also just to let you guys know that tomorrow, we don't have the exact time yet, but Colonel Doug McGregor is going to be coming and lots of people be wanting to know what he has to say. He's going to be unveiling some interesting plans that he has to try to strengthen the United States. You won't want to miss that one. I promise you. He's got a blueprint to help improve the country that we'll be sharing tomorrow as well. And also, just so you know, a lot of you don't have time to watch all the videos that we put out here. So we now have our podcasts that are out there: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will be shown right to the front door of our podcast. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.